Scott Burchill, thank you for coming back in such a short time to have a bit of a chat about developments in this massive regional conflict in Iran and Israel right now.
Good to be back, Joel.
I wanted to start off just simply looking at that Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, that landmark agreement that essentially was designed to curb Iran's nuclear program. One that Trump withdrew in 2018 from, notably under some pressure from Netanyahu in Israel. Would you be able to sort of walk us through a little bit why Trump abandoned the JCPOA in the first place and what suggests Netanyahu was a part of that? And how do you think it sort of fits into the broader dynamic right now between the US, Israel, Iran scenario?
Well, the 2015 agreement, the JCPOA, by most people's estimation, and Trita Parsi and others have written books about it, suggests that Iran was in almost full and total compliance with the agreement that John Kerry negotiated during the Obama administration. And even to the extent where the alleviation of sanctions, which was the quid pro quo for Iran of signing the agreement, weren't all followed through in the way they were supposed to. It was an agreement which most observers, independent observers, agreed was doing the job. Now, then Trump came along in 2018 and effectively pulled the plug on it. And the debate is, was Trump responding to pressure from Netanyahu, as you suggested? I'm not so sure it was Netanyahu applying pressure which was decisive. It was probably the financial backers of the Trump administration who had indicated that their funding for his campaign was contingent on abrogating the agreement and making a whole series of rather dubious claims about how poor it was and how Trump himself could negotiate a tougher and better agreement, which of course came to absolutely nothing. And we're now, of course, viewing firsthand the most important consequence of abandoning that agreement, which effectively has resulted in this conflict. So we've gone from an agreement that Tehran seemed to be in compliance with, even though they weren't getting exactly what they promised in terms of sanctions relief. And now we've got no agreement, although Trump keeps talking about maybe coming back to the negotiating table after a bit of fighting. But it all could have been avoided, of course, if that agreement had been maintained and perhaps strengthened in the period between 2018 and 2025. So it's not just the fault of Trump, it's also Biden's failure to reconstitute the agreement. And you can imagine the Iranians being fairly skeptical of the Americans keeping their word after what Trump did. So why put effort into negotiating a complex agreement only to find that it gets junked again as soon as the presidency changes in Washington?
So do you feel that potentially the deal brokered under Obama was the best deal sort of available? That wasn't really going to change. And was it in the interests of the US? Was it favorable towards the US? Because some would argue that the JCPOA was destined to fail in many ways. So do you think that deal was as good as it ever was going to get?
Yes, in terms of inspections, nuclear inspections, and keeping monitoring of the progress of the nuclear energy developments within Iran, I think it was. But there was also another reason why it was a good agreement, and that is in the course of the negotiations, John Kerry established a series of back channels between Washington and Tehran, which were established on personal relations, but also in the future for a way of, cauterizing any outbreaks of violence in the region, so that lines of communication between Washington and Tehran could be kept open, a bit like the old Moscow-Washington hotline.
And
And that was used recently, not that long ago, when there was a tit-for-tat series of relatively short-term attacks between Israel and Iran. And I think the Iranians used those back channels to indicate that they were only going to have a limited number of targets. They actually gave Washington and other states warning of where they were going to attack and when they were going to attack. And they kept their word. So those back channels are a priceless way of ensuring that these conflicts don't escalate out of control. Now, from an Iranian point of view, they probably have to question now the value of those back channels and whether they're worth maintaining or putting any trust in, because clearly in Trump's case here, although he claims not to have been involved in the initial decision to attack preemptively Iran last week, that the Americans were certainly aware of it and did nothing to stop the Israelis from launching the attack, which I have to say was a response largely to do with any reconstitution of a nuclear agreement. So this was an act of sabotage in the first instance to make sure that the Americans and the Iranians didn't get around to doing something like a JCPOA 2, which they were on the way to doing. And in fact, the Iranians, all the reports coming out of Tehran is that they were increasingly confident that some of the stumbling blocks could be overcome and that an agreement between Washington and Tehran could be reached within a period of months. Now, that was poison for Netanyahu. So the attacks and the timing of these attacks should be understood as not a concern about Iran developing nuclear weapons in the short term, because we know from Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, that they had no evidence Iran was actually close to or trying to achieve a weaponization of its nuclear technology. So what Netanyahu was doing was not reacting to some imminent achievement in that area, but to ensure that an agreement short of eliminating Iran's nuclear weapons or nuclear technology entirely was possible. And this is what prompted him to launch this unprovoked and, of course, illegal attack on Iran.
So it's an attack that the messaging from the get-go has been quite confusing, quite humiliating, essentially, for the Trump administration too, where the response was initially to kind of feign a bit of ignorance, then to backflip and say, hey, we were in on this the whole time. We understand the nature of it, and we also helped to plan the thing. And then to sort of come out yesterday and flip again and sort of say that this is unacceptable. And just like he brokered peace between India and Pakistan, that Iran and Israel can do the same. Is it this messaging, this discombobulated messaging that comes off the back of these back channels being smashed by Witkoff and things like that? Is this a reactive kind of move from the Trump government to save a bit of face, to try and back down? Or is it just another bit of smoke and mirrors here that we've sort of seen that's sort of been part of the continuity of the diplomacy all the way through this kind of period?
Well, I think we have to say there's a lot of flip-flopping in Trump's administration of policies across the board. So why would this particular area be any different to the way he's conducted himself in other areas? Mainly, for example, if you look at the tariffs, being instituted, then suspended, and then reconstituted, and then suspended again and renegotiated. That seems to be the house style, if you like, of the Trump administration when it comes to negotiating with other governments. But Trump was very clear to point out that he had this was not an American decision, that he did not, it was not an American operation, though clearly he was aware that it was going to occur. His problem now, of course, is that in many ways he can either end the conflict by reconstituting those negotiations, or at least signaling how that might occur, or he has to join the side of Israel and provide them with more than just diplomatic support at the United Nations, and more than just anti-ballistic missile technologies and some other munitions provisions. So he's really got now, he's painted himself into a bit of a corner. He's got to jump one side or the other. And the problem he has is not so much what he might want personally, but what his MAGA base wants. And one of the things that they emphasized a lot, particularly during the election, was that Trump was the peace candidate, to quote Tulsi Gabbard. Now, he's not showing so much of that. He was going to solve the Ukrainian war, Russia war within a couple of days. He was going to solve the Gaza conflict as well, and now he's got the third one right on his doorstep. So he's really painted himself into a difficult situation. Does he jump aboard with the Israelis, which he's under pressure to from Israeli backers, financial backers, and supporters within the US? Or does he say, well, my reputation is at stake here. I don't really want to be dragged into a direct conflict with Iran, particularly if fuel prices escalate further, as they already have over the weekend, because that really does hit the MAGA base, when the price of petrol goes up. So what's he going to do? Who knows? Because it's an inconsistent, he's almost driven by happenstance, and he's a bit of a maverick when it comes to any consistency of policy approach. So he could go either way, but I can't see in the end what the long-term gain is, because perhaps the Israelis might say, okay, we've destroyed most of the nuclear infrastructure, and it's going to take the Iranians a bit longer to reconstitute it all. But most people think it's the knowledge of how to build weapons. It's the ability to conceal some of their centrifuges and their enriched uranium deep underground, away from the technology that's available currently to the Israelis to destroy. So it wouldn't be a devastating setback in terms of the development of that campaign, perhaps to nuclearize the weapons of Iran. And, what is the message here? The message is, if you've got nuclear weapons, you're going to be safe. That's what North Korea has learned. And if you wanted to give impetus to the development of nuclear weapons, this is precisely what you would do to Iran. But the idea of regime change, I think, is a complete fantasy for a whole lot of reasons. One, most obviously, there's no obvious candidate or group of candidates who have been prepared to displace the current administration in Tehran, and also no popular support, or no obvious popular support for it, but also there's no means of achieving that kind of thing. They're very different things to bombing campaigns and putting troops on the ground and trying to take political control of a territory. You might be able to do it in parts of Syria and little parts of southern Lebanon and Gaza, but Iran's a whole different kettle of fish. And I don't think anyone seriously believes that this will either lead to political change of any significant kind in Iran, let alone regime change.
And it seems to have galvanized parts of the population in Iran that may have been more critical of the regime as well. We've seen footage of people from more progressive groups in Iran out there on the streets, kind of protesting or supporting the government's actions in light of what's happening, a whole nation being under attack. And seeing the images of car bombs going off, water pipelines being blown off, these kind of like wanton civilian attacks that are happening within Tehran, as as it progresses, it makes you actually think about how the West sees the metrics of failure and success on the modern battlefield. Because as you sort of speak to, there has been no sign that Iran's kind of regional hegemony, its strength, has been dented by this. If anything, it's kicked the hornet's nest over. And we've seen what the repercussions of this are in Haifa and Tel Aviv every day. But firstly, I just wanted to speak to you. You've mentioned that Israel's preemptive strike was a violation of the UN Charter. And essentially, other people on the other side are saying it still fits with Israel's right to defend itself. But how strong is Iran's legal case here for self-defense, for starters? And how has the international community, including Australia, been, silent on condemning Israel's actions? How does that look?
Okay, just before I say that, the galvanizing argument is very important to note because it's not just about persuading people who might be critical of the regime to come on board. It also gives the government a more authoritarian power to clamp down on those dissidents, or clamp down on those who might be varying from the line of the regime. So there's two parts to that. As far as the legal case is concerned, it's a clear violation of the sovereign nation under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. It also, under Article 52, gives Iran the right of self-defense to respond to that attack. The idea that somehow or other you can launch a preemptive attack and then claim self-defense is kind of hilarious, and no one seriously takes it. They tried it in the Bush administration, for example, in 2003 when they attacked Iraq, claiming that there were imminent weapons of mass destruction, which justified a preemptive attack. But there were virtually no international lawyers who agreed with that at all. As it proved, of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction anyway. So the argument collapsed fairly shortly after the war had commenced. So the resuscitation of that argument, the preemptive argument that justified Israel attacking Iran from that perspective in advance of any response or any provocation, is, of course, complete nonsense. And although it doesn't, a critic or a realist in international politics will say, well, it doesn't matter anyway. It's happened, so you have to deal with it. But the idea that of Israel going to the United Nations Security Council and claiming it's acting out of self-defense would fall apart very quickly, and it would require the diplomatic protection of Washington as a veto-wielding power within the Permanent Five of the United Nations Security Council to defeat what would otherwise be, I think, pretty hostile responses to Israel's behavior. But it is interesting, as you did say, a lot of countries, Australia, the United Kingdom, and France, as well as the United Kingdom, France, Australia, and the US, have all invoked this notion of self-defense, not as far as Iran is concerned, but as far as Israel is concerned. And what's fascinating is that none of these people have ever been asked, well, does Iran have a right to self-defense? Given it was, it was a victim of an unprovoked illegal attack, without warning, without legal backing, without any Security Council resolutions authorizing it. Where is its rights to self-defense? So it's a good indication of just how tame the media is when it doesn't even ask what is an obvious question to ask all foreign ministers in the West and all prime ministers in the West. Just a simple one: does Iran have the right of self-defense to fight back under Article 52 of the UN Charter, given it was attacked by Israel?
And we're seeing this kind of compound the issues regarding public trust, particularly at the national broadcaster. We've seen at the ABC blanket coverage of the damage in Tel Aviv from the strikes, but very opaque kind of coverage about the goings on in Tehran and Isfahan and Shiraz and all these attacks that are happening across the country. There seems to be, as you said, Penny Wong's echoed those self-defense sentiments with regards to Israel only, even though she had spoken to her Iranian counterpart quite early, and is potentially avoiding that phone call right now with her Israeli counterpart. Why do you think we have such a kind of mixed message regarding this issue, and how does it align with our broader foreign policy that's on display in the Middle East right now?
Well, I'm not sure it is a mixed message. That's the problem. I think it's very much consistent with how we invoked self-defense for Israel in response to the October 7th, 2023 attacks in Gaza, or just into Israel from Gaza by Hamas. And it's just sort of a consistent and um, it's a consistent the same argument really, except in this case it's even more absurd because what is the Iran is not attacking, did not attack Israel. It was Israel who attacked Iran. So they started it. And it's going to be a very interesting sort of discussion to follow because a lot of the pro-Israel commentary about Gaza begins with the argument that, well, Hamas started this on October 7th, 2023, as if there was no prehistory. But it was very important to those pro-Israeli commentators, particularly in the Murdoch press, that the initiator was the one that the initiator of the conflict, being Hamas in this particular instance, carries the burden of moral responsibility for the fighting that subsequently took place. Well, apply that in this case, and who is morally responsible for these attacks? And if they start saying, "Oh, well, it all predates that," they're reproducing the argument that they're avoiding at all costs when it comes to Gaza, because as we know, the Israeli attacks on Gaza go back decades. Yet we only want to start talking about them from October 7th, 2023 onwards. So it's going to be interesting to see how they square the circle on this one, because clearly, and it's not even in dispute. I mean, Israel initiated this attack. It was an act of aggression, violation of international law, and prior to that, the conflict had not escalated.
So I just sort of want to go back to, you were mentioning along this line, like you were mentioning that it's galvanized this, attack has also galvanized the Iranian public. It's allowed the regime to have strength and public support. I just sort of wanted to go to that regime change line. Say Israel will claim that its preemptive strike was about taking out nuclear assets to prevent them from being able to develop the technology. But the words regime change are also being thrown around. And, there's clips going around of Netanyahu talking about regime change in different iterations about Iran dozens and dozens of times over a 30 or 40-year period. So what is the evidence that must be motivating the Israelis and some in Washington to think that regime change is possible in Iran?
Well, I'm not sure they do. I think it's just wishful thinking. I remember in the case of Iraq, they found a guy called Ahmad Chalabi, who was going to be the next, president or prime minister or leader of Iraq, and and no one in Iraq had heard of him. He'd been in exile for 35 years. Well, I see the BBC are now trying to run the argument that that the son of the Shah is going to be the possible successor to the Ayatollah's regime. Now, if that's the case, that'll come as a huge shock to the people of Iran who probably never heard of him, frankly, and who have one thing in common, if nothing, and that was a detestation of the Shah's regime and everything that went along with it. So, as I said a bit earlier, there's no evidence they've prepared the way for regime change. It's one thing to decapitate the leadership, and you can perhaps get away with that. But if you have you actually have no plan to substitute people in afterwards, you're inviting all sorts of trouble. And the last thing that the Americans would want to do is see a collapse of the a regime in Iran, leading to anarchy of the kind we've seen recently, for example, in Syria. And in fact, there's stories coming out of Washington this morning which suggest that they want Khamenei to stay there because he's the most likely candidate to negotiate a deal with the Americans on nuclear weapons.
Well, on
So
that, on that,
that might not be Israel's preference, but I mean the Americans are going to ultimately decide this, whether they like it or not.
so is the foreign policy class in America now sharpening their claws, you think, in the background a little bit? For the first time in maybe 3 decades, they may be looking at some kind of form or a version of America First policy with regards to the Middle East based on this particular scenario? Or is it just trying to figure out how to skin the cat in a way that allows them to help Israel and save face?
Well, if you look at Israel, this is the fifth country that Israel's attacked in the last 18 months in the region. But if you look at most of those, they've involved land grabs. So they've managed to try and either push buffer zones back into those countries, like into Lebanon, or they've just taken more land like they have in Syria. And Gaza. That's not a plan anyone thinks will work when it comes to Iran. You're looking at a very large country, both population size and when it comes to land size. But even some of the most fanatical Israeli settlers do not are not claiming chunks of Iran as being part of Greater Israel. So this is a war that is, in a sense, revenge for Iran's support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for Hamas in Gaza, and also for the Assad regime in Syria. I think it has a lot more to do with those sorts of concerns, payback for that support, than it does a concern with imminent nuclear weapons emerging in Iran, which I think is even the Americans are not even trying to pretend that is likely in the near future. But of course, all of these attacks are going to accelerate that process, if nothing else. So they're going to achieve in a shorter period of time what they claim to be fighting to oppose.
So that veto essentially from the Trump administration on whacking the Ayatollah is in the works there, and you say it's probably much to Israel's kind of disappointment. Is there something here that we're not thinking about or speaking about, potentially an elephant in the room? And that is what we're seeing on these videos at the moment, which is the ability, the massive capability of Iran to engage in these rocket strikes, essentially using a combination of conventional parabolic ballistic missiles and this new technology, which is a changer completely, which are these hypersonic missiles, which we're seeing reaping huge damages, on their targets. Essentially destroying the David Sling, the Arrow, and the capability of the Iron Dome system. Do you feel that maybe this friendly discussions or the alluding to negotiations with the Ayatollah, a few other things, including some news that the Pentagon has advised Donald Trump, as you mentioned in our last interview, as per the simulations, that there's no chance America can send a fleet to the region without it getting decimated?
Yeah.
Uh, was America aware of this before these hypersonic missiles started flying? Or is it really now that they're seeing the impact that they're having on the ground that this is becoming more set in stone as a consequence?
Well, certainly, I think the hypersonic missiles are a bit of a game changer as far as anti-ballistic missile technology is concerned. And there are apparently at least two other categories of weapons that the Iranians have not yet deployed, which are also hypersonic, but with much larger payloads. So we haven't seen those yet, and they're probably holding those back. But the one thing we have to remember is you can't get regime change in a country without putting troops on the ground. And no Israelis want to do that. And the Americans certainly don't want to do that. But you shouldn't forget how long the Iranians fought the Iraqis. The Iraqis under Saddam Hussein were supported by the United States for the best part of a decade. in a terrible war with huge casualty rates, including the use of gas as a weapon in Halabja by the Iraqis, which which the Americans helped to supply to Saddam Hussein. So the capacity of the Iranians to absorb a long-term conflict and suffer the casualties is something that the Israelis probably shouldn't forget, because it's proved decisive in the past.
You mentioned that, and just a couple of hours ago, I read a top foreign affairs analyst in Israel, very pro regime, very pro, Gaza even, has almost begged for them to step back. And he mentioned what you said about Iran, the tenacity of the Shia people in Iran to fight, to take punishment, and recommends that a deal has to be made sooner rather than later. Do you feel that this is something that is a consensus now amongst the rational people, with even within decision-making centers in Tel Aviv, based on what is happening on the ground?
I think that probably the military intelligence people in Israel are probably all on board about damaging Iran's enrichment program and its capacity to build nuclear weapons over the next decade. But there was no urgency about it. So there's a lot of anger, I think, uh, between the intelligence and the military sector and the political class within Israel. And I think there would be some cynicism amongst intelligence and military leaders about Netanyahu's motives for launching this attack when he did, because there's certainly no evidence that that the Iranians are suddenly close to achieving the weaponization of nuclear missiles. So the timing then has to be explained in that sense. And we all know about Netanyahu's domestic political problems. There was going to be a Knesset vote on the government, which could have collapsed 2 days, I think, after the attack was launched. He's also giving evidence in corruption trials, and there's a whole series of domestic issues that he has to deal with, and they all get postponed immediately that a new conflict of this kind breaks out. Now, I'm not saying this is the sole motive. It's one factor, but it might be more help in explaining the timing of the attack rather than the nature of it. Because I don't think anyone seriously believes that the Ayatollah's regime will suddenly collapse because of some car bombs and drones and a few ICBMs landing on military sites. The Iranians have got a very high tolerance of pain when it comes to conflicts, as they proved in the war with Iraq. They're not going to give that away very quickly. And as I said, there's been almost no preparatory work done by the regime changes. The people like John Bolton and others in the US who have been pushing for this for years, they just literally have no one who not only have no one of any popularity, they literally have no one with any profile that they could slot into place. Let alone know how the domestic population, which has had, remember the Islamic Revolution was in 1979.
A while
Okay,
away. Yep.
so we're talking about 46 years of state indoctrination. Now, it's like all regimes. There's certainly unpopular aspects to it, and there's lots of dissident groups, but there's really been no occasion in that 46 years when the regime looked like it was going to topple.
And we would have known about it if there was, eh?
We certainly would have. And, if you look by regional standards, it's a stable country politically. You look around all the neighbors, and, no other country in the world, in that part of the world, is as stable, except perhaps for Israel. And Israel's governments chop and change all the time. But the Iranian regime is about the most stable in the region.
Also, militarily, it's been one of the most restrained in the region out of every single party around it, right?
It's been restrained. It hasn't attacked its neighbors. It's invited international atomic energy inspections. And of course, the elephant in the room is that Israel has nuclear weapons, which no one wants to talk about. Iran does not. And we have all this concentration on the dangers associated with a country in the region with nuclear weapons or with the potential to have nuclear weapons. And we've got one that's had them since the 1970s.
That seems to echo another thing too that seems to be standing out is that Iran is a civilization state. It's a 5,000-year-old entity. There's not many of these on the planet. Well, you got India, you got China. There's something that's disrespected, I think, in that. One of those things that comes with it is their diplomacy. They have a unique brand of diplomacy that I think is, if it hasn't impressed interlocutors in the West, it's definitely made an impact on them as being a unique form of diplomacy that has it has a good effect and it works well. Uh, I wanted to speak about more the global implications of what's going on here a little bit more. You see, Iran's ties with Russia are strengthening. There are, you know, some back channels going on there where Russia's offering material support now, potentially military support in the future. You never know. I've seen transponders being switched off on Chinese aircraft landing in Tehran, dropping off potentially some, next generation Chinese goodies for the battlefield. So, with the Abraham Accords also being sort of bent and twisted in so many ways over the last couple of months, and this escalation, uh, is this going to trigger? And you've got things like Pakistan now sending channels to India, essentially saying if India encroaches on Iranian airspace, that Pakistan is going to attack Israel itself. Talks about nuclear exchanges. So is this, we're looking at a wider regional conflict, or are there diplomatic off ramps that could de-escalate these tensions?
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of it broadening beyond what we've currently got, which is bad enough. But I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if Trump says after 3 weeks of this, okay, you had your go to the Israelis. I mean, you had your go, you inflicted damage, you decapitated some of the intelligence heads, the IR, the Revolutionary Guard heads, some of the defense people and intelligence leaders. You had a good go. You've degraded some of their technologies and the development of these weapons. Now's the time for a deal. And he might put the case to the Israelis that the Iranians would be more likely to make concessions rather than have this conflict continue. But Trump lives in a kind of bubble where deals can be struck at any time or with anyone about anything, and it doesn't always come to fruition. But one of the things we've really missed, and you alluded to it then a second ago, is that I think it was yesterday Trump spoke with Putin about the conflict. And it may be that because some of those back channels between Washington and Tehran have now been shut down, that the Americans are going to have to find out some more things via Moscow about what the Iranians are thinking. It's a crazy world, but this is the way it goes. I mean, as someone said to me, I think it was a year and a half ago, where do you think Ukraine gets most of the petrol or diesel to drive its tanks and military hardware? It buys them from the Russians. So, some of these things might appear to be contradictory and confusing, but the world is that complex. It is that confusing at times. And if you're an American in the Foggy Bottom, the State Department, or you're in somewhere within the beltway of the intelligence services, and you want to find out what Iranian thinking is, where it's going, and your back channels have been shut down because you've seen to be someone of bad faith, then you may well have to rely on those who have good dealings with the Iranians and the Israelis. And that's at this point in time, the Russians have better relations with the Iranians than the Americans do, and they also have a pretty good relationship with Israel. So they may be, Putin may be dealing himself into a negotiation that has some side benefits for him later on when it comes to dealing with the Ukrainians.
You're so right about this, and it's incredible that Putin has a story to tell in this after everything. And just as an aside to what you just said there, do you think that there might be a recognition of the sphere of influence that Iran has here within this negotiation by Washington to understand its actual civilization state, its power status a little bit more? And could Trump, who yesterday didn't rule out inviting Kim Jong over for a coffee? Is there a chance that he could gain some respect? Like, Trump gets into a scrap with someone, and if he thinks they're tough, he starts to respect them a little bit. Do you think that the balance, the diplomatic balance, could change a little bit in this negotiation, and that Israel could actually be squeezed out and be the junior partner in this?
Well, remember we spoke last time about how Trump's national security advisor was sacked because he appeared to be negotiating with Netanyahu behind Trump's back to undermine the nuclear agreement that Trump was trying to negotiate with the Iranians. In terms of, well, you got to remember there's two things going on. Iran's sphere of influence has been under attack. They've lost influence in Lebanon with the degradation of Hezbollah. They've obviously lost influence with Hamas because Hamas has been crippled. And they've most crucially lost a lot of influence in Syria, where they had a very close relationship with the Assad regime, as did the Russians. So Iran's sphere of influence has diminished significantly, and that's a result of Israel's military campaigns in the region. But Trump's willingness to or desire to be seen as a peacemaker, to win a Nobel Peace Prize or whatever, is independent of those things, because basically he wants to be the guy who can say, well, look, I brought this to an end. He may have thought that Ukraine and Russia was too hard for a while, so put that on the back burner. But I can sort of settle this one down, maybe blend it in with a Gaza solution as well. But he's certainly looking for something that he can take credit for. And you have to think at this stage, we're 2/3 of the way through his first year in office. He hasn't got a lot to show for it in terms of international diplomacy, despite the claims he made during the election campaign that these things wouldn't have happened if I was the president, and when I become president, I'll solve them, in one afternoon. Well, he hasn't achieved anything, and as I said, you can't stress enough, his MAGA base are not pro-war. They're not the neocons of the Bush administration. He's also aware of what Iraq did to the second Bush term, Bush Jr.'s term. It basically crippled him, and he left office as one of the least popular presidents in American history. So he's aware.
And that was after the surge. That was after the surge. That was after all the moving and maneuvering to try and make this right against the grain, right?
Well, that was after a mission accomplished in Iraq. That's when the problems began. And so he was the last thing a president wants to be seen is a spent force in the last year of his office, because they know he's not going to be re-elected. He can't be re-elected in the case of Trump. And, people start ignoring you because you don't count as much and you're not important to the future. So he would be aware of what damage the Iraq imbroglio dealt to Bush Jr. And he certainly doesn't want to reprise that for himself in the case of Iran or even in Gaza, and certainly not in the Ukraine. So he's going to have to rethink some of that and realize, well, if I follow the current trajectory, that's what I'm going to. That's a possibility. I'll just be seen as the guy who stoked the fires, made grand claims, and never delivered on any of them. And he doesn't want that. So the most likely scenario, or perhaps the most likely motivation for him to tell the Israelis to pull their heads in and stop, which he can do it in half an hour, is well, this is just not going to look good for me. I don't care about you, but it's not
Right.
looking good for me.
And
And
even
that's a,
even Miro Adelson doesn't count when he gets that in his head. No one counts anymore.
well, he's got the money now. He doesn't need to get it any more. He can't stand again for office, so he doesn't need to raise funds. I mean, they'll complain and they'll whinge and whine, but half the country is. You could see it from his birthday military parade yesterday, or where he's significantly alienating large sections of the community. And the opinion polls that I've seen, the preliminary ones about getting the US involved in Iran, are similar to the ones that have just been released about the UK getting involved in Iran. And that is, it's lucky to be 20% support for those. And that's as this drags on and the destruction gets worse, those figures will only go down. So if you want to, if you're trying to find a ray of light in this terrible darkness, you want to appeal to Trump's sense of legacy. That at the end of the day, you've got to come out with something that you can claim was something you achieved, and he's not going to. He probably thought it was going to be Ukraine and Russia because Putin would just comply. Well, that's not going to happen, and hasn't happened. It may well be that Netanyahu, who is highly dependent on the US in so many ways, may be actually an easier, might be actually easier for them to do. We'll see.
So where does that leave Iran right now? It's galvanized its population. It's rolled out its missile launches. It may or may not be making a nuclear weapon. It's speaking with its regional allies and its security partners. So how does Iran look at its strategic calculations moving forward? How does it redefine its red lines? And what are the prospects for another nuclear deal, potentially after this sort of double crossing? There's been messages coming out from the regime that there is no more talks to be had. I mean, the talks have been cancelled. I know this is tough talk. Do you think that Iran can be brought back to the table under Trump with some kind of Israeli representative, and think that they're going to get an honest broker on the other side to deal with?
Well, it's certainly possible, but they don't want to let the conflict be the driver of it. So they don't want to be seen to be forced into an agreement by what Israel's currently doing to them, which delays everything. But I think he's right. Trump's talking about 60 days, isn't he? That there'll be a renegotiation sometime around 60 days. Now, if that's the case, that's possible, but the conflict would have to end well before that. Um, but again, the Iranians will be saying, well, how do we hold you to account for this? How can we be sure that you'll keep your word? Because you tore up the JCPOA in 2018. So why would we trust you this time? And they would need absolute assurances, presumably an agreement ratified by the Security Council, the entire Security Council of some kind, to give it added weight and strength, so it would be an enduring agreement.
This
But I
could
think,
this couldn't be done with Witkoff in the. You would imagine he'd have to reshuffle his Middle East envoy team, or
well, he was already doing it. That's the thing. He was involved in it at the day before the attack began. So what that shows to the Iranians is that the Americans can be pushed around by the Israelis. And that's not the message that Trump wants them to have. He doesn't want to give Israel the potential to sabotage anything that he's doing. But the messages coming out of Tehran is that they sort of turned a bit of a corner in terms of overcoming some of the problems that were in the negotiations. There was nothing that was seen to be completely off the board. And that's when, of course, Netanyahu struck, because the last thing he wanted was an agreement between the Israelis and the Americans. And he made sure that was taken off the board by attacking Iran directly. Now, Doesn't mean it can't come back, but the Iranians, you can't blame the Iranians for being cynical and skeptical about how genuine all this will be if that can simply happen in the middle of a negotiation. If you can be suddenly attacked without provocation in the middle of talking directly with the Americans, they'd have to, be convinced that there was that couldn't be, it couldn't happen again.
I'm writing about this sort of period of diplomacy coming out of Washington, and I've coined something I call red wedding diplomacy, named after the last Game of Thrones episode in season 3 there, where essentially you can go out and you can kill Zelensky, you can go out there and kill Putin, you can strike people in cars, you can hit them in their homes. But this sort of method of doing things, decapitations, preemptive strikes, just wiping out families, things like that, has changed the nature of diplomacy, I think, forever in the Westphalian world. I don't know if there's been many examples throughout history over the last 500 years where this kind of say one thing, kill the other is happening so often. And, apart from just leaning on that whole fragile porcelain that is, international grand geopolitics, is there a factor here? Like, I just saw a tweet from the air radars essentially saying over a dozen stratofuelers have been sent over the Atlantic out of every state in the United States. You, that can only speak to one thing, to be loading that many huge military fueling planes across the Atlantic there. And then you see these kind of mixed messages all the time now where they're saying, hey, we're going to sit down and have diplomacy, and then we're going to organize a drone strike on, on Russia's strategic bomber fleet, or we're going to have our second round of nuclear negotiations, but the day before Israel falsely lures the whole Air Force brass into a room and kills them all together. Has this completely shattered the matrix of kind of what was the conventions of modern diplomacy?
I'm not sure it's actually as new as you probably imagine. If you want to look at the history of the Palestinian national movement, it's a history of leaders and potential leaders being assassinated.
Totally. I'm more talking about like a regional power, like as far as dealing between superpowers, spheres of interest and things like this, more so in that state, of the bigger powers.
Well, that speak softly and carry a big stick. On the one hand, you say, okay, we'll negotiate here, but, have a look what I've got in my left hand. And, I'm not afraid to use it. And for credibility purposes, as they like to call it in international politics, you've got to be seen to follow through in your threats every so often. For example, the Kosovo war, where the US intervened against Serbia, was very much a case of NATO credibility being under challenge by Belgrade. There was no other real reason why the NATO would attack.
Was that
Serbia.
Allied Freedom? Operation Allied Freedom?
Well, I think the operations get a bit confusing, but they attacked them for 43 consecutive days, including bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and taking out TV stations and civilian targets. Now, there was no imminent threat to the region from Serbia. Certainly, sure, there was as the former Yugoslavia imploded, there was conflict between, Serbs and Croats and Kosovars and Bosnians, and it went on for a long time. But when you look at the history of it now, and most people, the authoritative people, say this was a war of NATO's credibility, because you couldn't have in Europe countries defying NATO's rule. So a lot of the the actions of NATO, which seem to be completely over the top in terms of the need for them, were a product of the United States in particular, but NATO generally, ensuring that its the rest of Europe knew who the master was and who was really running this show. And if you have to bomb someone for 43 days just to remind them of who's really running Europe, then so be it. So it's not actually a new development. It's a consistent one, particularly for those who, in a card game, will always lead with their strongest suit. In the case of NATO countries, it's military power. In the case of Israel, it's military power. It's not political power, it's military power. So you use what it is you have as an advantage to get your political ambitions satisfied. So, whether it changes the nature of geopolitics in the region, I'm a little skeptical about, because as you said earlier, Persian civilization goes back centuries. It's not going to disappear anytime soon. And it's a country, a very large country. I think, what's the population? 90 million or something like that. It's compared with Israel, which today announced that it was banning civilian airliners from evacuating Israeli citizens from Ben Gurion Airport. They're worried about the imagery and the reality of people who are leaving the country, who have not experienced these sorts of attacks. They're used to Gazans sending what Norman Finkelstein used to call firecrackers across into Israel proper, but they're not used to hypersonic missiles smashing up civilian towers and military and intelligence facilities. And they've lost a lot of people have left Israel during the Gaza conflict, particularly the professional middle classes, those who can get jobs in Western Europe and North America, and who want to raise families in a more peaceful environment, have already got out, and many will want to get out now, which is why the Israelis have taken the steps they've taken in the last 24 hours, 48 hours about preventing others from leaving. It's a conscript army, after all. So, that's not going to change the nature of geopolitics. The question is, it's the unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld used to talk about. How will it end, and what will the long-term consequences be? And what we are seeing is Israel's diplomatic isolation on Gaza. The world is shrinking. Israel's world is shrinking. And even more recently, we've seen its erstwhile European backers moving away, particularly on the issue of mass starvation and the denial of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. So Israel's not in a position to lose too many more friends. It obviously regards the US as its major sponsor correctly, but it's losing those fence sitters and the Europeans who have reflexively always defended everything that it has done. And I suspect that there's a lot of waiting and watching going on in Europe and elsewhere about how this conflict is playing out.
I'm with you. And around Gaza, I've even seen, Ursula von der Leyen making, some kind of concession towards the situation there, basically, on the humiliation. I think for these Western leaders more so than anything. On that, though, we're seeing Starmer has essentially, Keir Starmer, the British PM, has scrambled military assets to the region under the threat of helping to secure the region. You've got the French, Macron, getting on the front foot and being surprisingly probably the most incendiary out of all the European leaders on Iran, and saying that Iran needs to be stopped. You've got Penny Wong and the ABC saying the same thing. You've got stratofuelers moving across the face of the earth. There's this thing, I think I spoke to you last time a little bit about the crazies, when you've got enough crazies in a room, enough ideological zealots. Do you feel that there's something maybe happening behind here that could be catastrophic, that might strong arm all these kind of rational courses of action that you're kind of mentioning?
Well, look, I'm sure the Western Europeans and the North Americans and others, even the Australians, would like to see the destruction of Iran's nuclear programs. across the board. Whether they're prepared to see the cost of that and pay for the cost of that is another thing. And when I say pay for it, these wars are incredibly expensive, and someone's going to have to pick up the bill. And if they go on for for too long, the bill is astronomical. So that's just the financial bill. Then there's the diplomatic bill.
Yep.
And the biggest fear that those countries have, the ones you mentioned, is a growing gap between popular sentiment and political views. So it's all very well for heads of the European Commission and the European Union and the Australian government and the French government and the British government to say one thing about their views of Iran or Gaza. But one of the reasons why they changed their tune on Gaza was because that gap between popular anger and opposition to what Israel's doing in Gaza and what their initial position was got too long, it got too large, had to be closed. Apart from, worries about legal complicity and all sorts of other allied issues. But no government which has to go to the population and get re-elected wants a yawning gap between popular sentiment and what appears to be a completely different set of views and priorities from the ruling government. So when and you can see they did it in unison in a sense. It all just started. They used the pretext of starvation, not because they're particularly concerned about Gazans being starved. They don't care about Palestinians at all, but they do care about their own political survival. And they saw these demonstrations every week. They saw the petitions. They got the phone calls to their offices. They got they know they can't stop people viewing the awful footage of suffering civilians, kids, mothers, families. They just can't stop their population seeing these images. And they realized that if they didn't change tune, they were going to be in real trouble. Even though they may not have to face the electorate tomorrow, at some point they will, and they'll be held to account for what they've said and what they've done. So that's when politicians move. When the pressure gets too hard and too strong, and that gap between gets too large, someone has to move. And the population's already decided where it stands. The government is there, has to make the change.
So this might be explaining some of the strange conflicting messages coming out of Washington, but it doesn't so much explain the lies essentially coming out of Canberra. Miles speaking to the Iranian nuclear weapons that Tulsi Gabbard had dismissed. I think Penny Wong also kind of hinted towards it as well. It feels like public sentiment in Australia isn't as defined on this topic as it is in the US quite yet. Mainly because in the US, people are mulling over whether or not they're going to be sent to war. But do you think that, that these perceptions have been shaped by misinformation? And I want to speak to the media here, who I think, in Australia, the abrogation from the media, the public broadcaster in particular, to help shape the public discussion and narratives around this conflict is so stark. And the disconnect's almost starker than the political class, who actually have, a reason to sort of be a little bit opaque on some of this stuff. How do you feel that the media here is responsible for, keeping us mushrooms in the dark stored in shit down here on this island continent at the bottom of the earth?
Well, it's continuing its very poor performance during the conflict in Gaza. But I'll tell you, give an interesting contrast. When in the weeks prior to the war beginning in Iraq in April 2003, there were huge demonstrations in Australia, in all the major capital cities, as there were in other capital cities around the world, opposing the prospects of war. And Howard participated in the war anyway, right? So he sent troops. In this case, the possibility of Australia sending troops to fight Iran is about as close to zero as you could get. And yet there hasn't been any demonstrations yet. Okay, there's been there's been the Gaza demonstrations, but there haven't been widespread, large anti-war, Israel demonstrations about the issue of the attack on Iran. So the situations have almost reversed themselves, where that's not required because the government knows there's just no basis of support, popular support, no matter how much the media might want to drum up the threat that Iran poses for, God knows who. There's literally no prospect that the Albanese government or even the opposition would advocate joining a military contingent to fight on Israel's behalf. And that's because, to put it crudely, Israel has screwed the pooch on Gaza. They just couldn't generate enough support for Israel, no matter what it was trying to do. And everyone knows they started this conflict. So that again is going to count against them. So yes, the media obviously plays an important role in shaping opinion and managing opinion. But as I said, over Gaza, people have gone to alternative sources, so they're not limited by the mainstream media, and the mainstream media is just pretty incompetent, and not just in reporting, but in selling the message. And they don't have the same kind of pull and control and reach that they used to have. People are more cynical about the ABC in Australia. They're more cynical about the tabloids and the Murdoch press, and people are sourcing their own information on the internet to avoid the gatekeepers in the mainstream media. And that counts against anyone who wants to generate public support for Israel in its conflict with Iran. But you ask yourself, is it likely that Australia would join a military contingent to side with Israel to fight Iran? And I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who thinks that's going to happen.
I agree with you there. Look, I'll get one more question into you while I've got you. Following on from that, you mentioned that sort of case for war that was being built for Iraq and the resistance to it on the streets. They still went forward with it anyway. But yeah, it's quite interesting. Colin Powell was, shaking little vials at the UN. You had all this kabuki going on with lawyers and diplomats for months, for a couple of years almost, to build this case that was, against the grain all the way. But here, the case isn't there on paper. It's Israel's case, quite clearly, not Washington's. There wasn't a 9/11 that kind of buffed it up and bolstered it, and put it into the as a sellable item to Middle America and the West. So now they're getting pounded every day by these missiles, which are unable to be intercepted. And pending the US or the West jumping in with some big aerial campaign, it's going to look pretty bad for Israel here as time moves forward. Have they essentially opened up a channel to fast track the resolution to the genocide in Gaza and to end their belligerence as a preemptive striker in the region for a year or so?
Well, two things I'd say. One is what we're seeing with the Iran nuclear issue is weapons of mass destruction part 2. So Israel and the United States and Australia and every country that claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that lesson has been understood as being a fraud, and that is something that it will count against them if they tried to make a broader case for intervening against Iran in a sort of multilateral way, because people are just too cynical now. They remember what they were told in 2003, and they're not going to fall for it again, particularly when no one seriously argues, other than Mr. Netanyahu at the UN holding up comic book type pictures of bombs with fuses lit. No one really takes that stuff very seriously. So that's the first point I think I'd make about that. But the Gaza thing is a worry. They've turned off the internet. They've turned off most of the electricity. So even those who have managed to report on what's happening are really up against getting the live feeds out of the strip, and so therefore it's a perfect cover, if you like, to implement the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which has always seems to have been the intention all along of the Israelis in that part. The only thing that's going to count against them is the perhaps need to refocus the attention of the military on Iran, which poses obviously a much more significant threat to Israel itself. So they may not have the resources to do that and to do the ethnic cleansing in Gaza at the same time. So they may have to, shift. They've already shifted some troops out of that area to prepare for any, I guess, all sorts of things like civilian issues, like putting fires out, containing, diffusing unexploded weapons and ordnance and all that sort of thing. So they can't probably do both as easily at the same time. But it is a worry that Gaza falls off the radar for a while we're focusing on Iran, and coupled with the fact that they're trying to make it as difficult as possible to report on Gaza by banning international journalists, and also making those the Palestinian journalists in Gaza, from actually being able to do their job by turning off the power, turning off the internet. Because a lot of that citizen journalism that we've been seeing, where people have filmed things on their phones, can't get out as easily as it been up to this point. The first 600 days, you could tune into someone's live feed on their iPhone and see what was happening. If you cut off telecommunications, makes it extremely difficult, and it is a real worry. So we shouldn't lose focus on Gaza at this moment in time, because it's a perfect cover, as you say, for finishing it off, or what Finkelstein calls the final solution in Gaza.
And we see Morandi, the Iranian spokesman, speak to that exactly. So, I mean, as far as in diplomatically, Iran is engaging with Israel primarily because of what's going on in Gaza. So, I mean, diplomatically, if they are getting pounded and Washington is reticent to come in there and fight their war for them and demands them to come to the table, there's going to become a point from that point. If the longer Israel refuses to do that, its position is going to be weaker and weaker and weaker. So do you feel that potentially, if that scenario does happen, that the genocide in Gaza could be on the table and it could go against their ethnic cleansing plans?
Possibly if Trump wants to fold them into the same solution issue. I don't know. It's hard to know at this stage. But one thing is the Israelis are now feeling the effects of that bombing campaign that they never really had to endure in the past.
Yep.
And that how that changes public opinion domestically within Israel is something we have to keep an eye on. It's very difficult to predict how that will what will do, whether it drive people. People get sick of going into bunkers, air raid bunkers. They might do it for a couple of days, or a few days or a week or something. But after that, the novelty of it wears off very quickly, particularly when your much vaunted anti-missile defense systems seem to be thwarted by the technology which is homegrown within Iran itself. And that must be a real worry to those who are concerned about public opinion in Israel, and how the government can hold itself together in the face of what are now multi-dimensional conflicts that they're fighting simultaneously.
So let's hope the combination of Trump's incompetence, Iran's capability, and the average Israeli's neoliberal entitlement and aversion to having their daily lives and routines disrupted could all add up in ending the worst genocide we've seen in living memory. Thank you so much, Scott, for coming. It's backing it up in under a week, and you're informing a lot of people about parts of information that we can't really get anywhere at the moment. So I would love to be able to have you on from time to time just to sort of update us about some of these regional conflagrations, if you would be up for it.
Sure. Anytime.
Appreciate it, Scott. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Joe.
Cheers.